Across amusement parks around the world, cameras captured the seconds when machines failed, restraints stopped working, trains rolled backward, cars derailed, and people were thrown from seats they trusted to keep them alive. A teenager climbed toward the top of a coaster, heard the chains stop clicking, then felt the train roll backward at full speed before it slammed into the car behind him. A mother fastened her restraint, questioned it once, was told it was safe, and seconds later was flung from a steel coaster in front of her child. A worker stood beneath a ride that was powered down for inspection until a train moved without warning and crushed him before anyone could stop it. A decorative locomotive derailed inside a dark tunnel and collapsed onto the car below, pinning a young man to his seat until he died, surrounded by his friends. In every case, someone said afterward, it shouldn't have happened. Maintenance warnings were ignored, safety systems were altered, procedures were skipped, and in some cases the same rides had failed before. These are 9 deadly roller coaster malfunctions caught on camera. On July 19, 2013, a routine summer visit to an amusement park turned fatal in a matter of minutes. Rosa Esparza, a 52-year-old grandmother, arrived that afternoon at Six Flags Over Texas in Arlington, Texas, with members of her family, and like many visitors that day, she joined the line for the park's signature attraction, the new Texas Giant, a steel hybrid roller coaster known for its steep first drop and powerful turns. As boarding began, witnesses later recalled that Rosie appeared uneasy about her lap bar, and she said so out loud, noting that she heard fewer locking clicks than other riders. But when a ride operator checked the restraint and told her it was secure. The concern ended there, the train was dispatched, and the coaster began its slow climb out of the station. By the time the train reached the top of the lift hill, nothing seemed unusual, and the ride entered its first major descent as designed. But seconds later, as the train accelerated into an early, high-speed turn, something went catastrophically wrong because Rosie was no longer held firmly in her seat. And during that turn, she was ejected from the moving coaster, falling an estimated 75 feet and striking parts of the ride structure below. Operators stopped the ride immediately, and emergency crews were called, but Rosie was pronounced dead at the scene, and within minutes, the new Texas Giant was shut down as park officials cleared the area and began documenting what had happened, while shocked riders and family members were escorted away. That same day, the Arlington Police Department opened an investigation focusing on the ride's restraint system and the procedures used to verify that restraints were secure before dispatch. And according to the incident report, an employee had noticed that Rosie's lap bar sat higher than normal, but the ride's electronic indicators still showed the restraint as locked, so the train was allowed to operate. However, in the days that followed, Six Flags issued statements saying that no mechanical failure had been found, but the coaster remained closed as inspectors reviewed its safety systems, operator training, and restraint hardware. And when the new Texas Giant eventually reopened on September 14, 2013, the changes were clear because additional seatbelts had been installed on every seat, restraint padding had been redesigned, and a test seat was placed at the ride entrance to help guests check fit before boarding. So on September 10, 2013, Rosie Esparza's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Six Flags and parties connected to the ride's manufacture and operation, alleging that the restraint system and verification process were inadequate, and during the legal process, it emerged that components linked to restraint indicators had been replaced after the accident, though Six Flags continued to deny liability. And in November 2014, the case was settled for an undisclosed amount, bringing the legal proceedings to a close without a public finding of fault. But by then, Rosie's death had already become a reference point in industry discussions about lap bar design, sensor reliability, and the limits of relying on indicator lights over physical verification. And when the new Texas Giant resumed normal operation, it did so with more layers of restraint than it had before, a quiet acknowledgement that on that July afternoon in Arlington, the system designed to keep one rider safe had failed to do so, and the consequences had been permanent. On July 14, 2022, a roller coaster in Denmark broke apart mid-ride and killed a 14-year-old girl. That afternoon at Tivoli Friheden, an amusement park in Aarhus, visitors moved through the gates expecting a normal summer day, and among them were two teenagers who queued for Cobra, an inverted roller coaster known for its loops, speed, and the way it suspended riders beneath the track. So when the train dispatched shortly before 12:50 p.m., nothing appeared unusual, and the ride entered its cycle the same way it had countless times before. Cobra climbed, twisted, and accelerated as designed, but then, during the run, the structure of the train itself failed because the rear section of the coaster broke loose from the rest of the train. And in that moment, the ride stopped being a controlled system and became a mechanical emergency, with seats separating and hanging beneath the track while riders were left stranded several meters above the ground, unsure of what had just happened or what would happen next. Park staff halted operations immediately and emergency services were called, and police and paramedics arrived to a scene that no longer resembled an amusement ride but a suspended wreck. And while crews worked to secure the area and reach the riders, it became clear that the failure had already taken a life because a 14-year-old girl visiting from Copenhagen had suffered fatal injuries, and a 13-year-old boy who had been riding with her was injured and taken for medical treatment. As the park was evacuated and closed, Danish police began an investigation, and early statements focused on what could be confirmed without speculation that the rear part of the train had derailed, that riders were left hanging beneath the remaining structure, and that the incident was being treated as a serious mechanical failure, so authorities asked witnesses not to circulate images or videos online and instead submit any footage directly to investigators, a request that suggested how visually and structurally severe the incident had been. Later that day, Tivoli Friheden's management addressed the public, and the park's director, Henrik Ragborg Olsen, described what staff saw when they reached the ride, explaining that the rear two seats were hanging underneath the rest of the train, a detail that underscored the nature of the failure because this was not a temporary stop or a stalled lift, but a physical separation of components while the ride was in motion. For the next 2 days, the park remained closed as inspections continued, and while officials avoided assigning a definitive cause before the investigation concluded, one decision came quickly and without ambiguity because Tivoli Friheden announced that Cobra would never operate again and that the coaster would be permanently closed and dismantled, a response that spoke louder than any press release about how seriously the failure was being taken. As attention turned to Cobra's history, uncomfortable context emerged because this was not the first time the ride had been linked to a serious incident. And in 2008, shortly after Cobra originally opened, another derailment had occurred when part of the train came off the rails, injuring 4 riders, and although the coaster had been repaired and returned to service after that earlier accident, the repetition of a derailment years later raised questions about whether the underlying risks had ever been fully resolved. And while full technical findings were not immediately released to the public, the sequence of events alone told a disturbing story, because a modern, permanent roller coaster in a major European city had suffered a failure severe enough to kill a child and injure another in a matter of seconds. For the families involved, a day meant for excitement ended with a death notification, and a ride marketed as thrilling but safe became the last place a 14-year-old girl would ever visit. And although her name was not publicly released, the details of where she was, who she was with, and how quickly everything went wrong were enough to resonate far beyond Denmark. On August 28, 1999, a roller coaster rolled the wrong way and killed a mother and her child on a crowded seaside pier. That Saturday evening at Gillian's Wonderland Pier in Ocean City, summer crowds filled the wooden planks along the shore. And among them were Kimberly Bailey, a 39-year-old mother, and her 8-year-old daughter, Jessica Bailey, visiting from New York. They had come for what the pier promised best, a short burst of excitement on its newest attraction, a zigzag Wild Mouse-style roller coaster called Wild Wonder, which had opened just weeks earlier and was already drawing long lines. Wild Wonder looked modest compared to towering steel coasters, but its design relied heavily on precision because its first lift hill was steep and narrow, and once a train climbed that incline, the entire system depended on small steel components called chain dogs and safety dogs to keep the car from sliding backward. But earlier that summer, state inspectors had cleared the ride for operation, and nothing in the public-facing reports suggested danger, so when Kimberly and Jessica were seated in the front row, they likely felt lucky, close to the view, and first to feel the drop. So as the train dispatched, it climbed the lift hill at a controlled pace, the familiar clicking sound echoing across the pier. But as the car neared the top, the motion changed abruptly and began to roll backward down the hill. At first, the rollback might have seemed unreal, but it did not slow or stop, and gravity quickly turned the backward slide into a rapid descent. The safety system designed to prevent exactly this scenario did not engage, so the train accelerated in reverse toward a tight curve near the station, a section of track never meant to be entered backward at speed. Witnesses later described the moment with shock. One injured rider, Mark Madsack, recalling that he shouted, "Oh my God, it's coming back down," just seconds before the collision. The reversing car slammed into another train that was positioned near the loading area where new passengers were preparing to board, and the force of that impact was sudden and violent. During the collision, Kimberly Bailey and her daughter Jessica were ejected from the front of the car, thrown outward in front of dozens of onlookers, and the ride came to a halt almost immediately after, leaving horror where laughter had been moments earlier. Mark Madsack was injured along with his children, and his wife, who was waiting nearby, later told investigators that she saw a woman and a child fly from the car and knew instantly they could not have survived. Emergency responders rushed in, but both Kimberly and Jessica were pronounced dead, and the pier was sealed off as a fatal accident scene. As investigators began examining the wreckage, attention shifted quickly from the visible damage to what had happened days before the crash. Because records showed that maintenance work had been carried out on August 17th, just 11 days earlier, and during that work, the ride's original chain dogs and safety dogs had been replaced. And instead of manufacturer-approved components, locally fabricated parts made from non-hardened steel had been installed, a modification that was illegal under New Jersey law, and worse still, the springs meant to hold those components in proper alignment had been fitted with insufficient tension, allowing the dogs to misalign and wear down rapidly. So the state of New Jersey filed suit against both Gillian's Wonderland Pier and Zamperla, the ride's manufacturer, accusing the park of unsafe modifications and alleging that the manufacturer had failed to provide adequate replacement schedules and warnings for wear-prone components. The Wild Wonder coaster was removed permanently, and the pier never reopened. For Kimberly Bailey's husband and Jessica's father, the legal actions did little to ease the reality of that night, because a short ride meant for families had ended 2 lives in a matter of seconds. On June 14, 1986, a roller coaster car broke apart inside a shopping mall and 3 people were killed before the ride could stop. That Saturday night at West Edmonton Mall in Edmonton, Alberta, the indoor amusement park was busy with weekend crowds, and the signature attraction was Mindbender, a triple loop coaster marketed for speed, intensity, and spectacle. And in the rear car, 4 young adults were seated together: David Sager, Tony Mandrusiak, Cindy Sims, and Rod Chaco. And as the train tore through the course, the sensations were exactly what riders expected: sharp turns, rapid loops, and the feeling of being pinned into the seat by force. But near the end of the ride, something changed because the rear car began to move differently from the rest of the train, and that difference was not part of the design. Rod later described a sudden, unsettling sway, not the controlled lateral pressure of a turn, but a loose, unstable motion, and instinctively he grabbed for support because when a roller coaster stops feeling guided, the body notices before the mind catches up. What had started as a thrill turned into horror because investigators later determined that a wheel assembly on the rear car had detached after 4 critical bolts worked loose, and once that assembly fell away, the car could no longer stay properly aligned with the track. The failure escalated immediately because without full wheel guidance, the rear car derailed, and the restraints that were meant to hold the four riders in place were released during the chaos. And so in a fraction of a second, the car struck structural elements near the end of the course, including a concrete support pillar, and the violent stop that followed was catastrophic, throwing the four riders from the car and onto the concrete floor below. The train continued forward briefly before friction and damage slowed it enough that it could not complete the final loop, and as it rolled back and finally came to rest. The screams that echoed through the mall made it clear that this was not a ride malfunction that could be brushed off. Emergency responders rushed in, other riders were evacuated, and medical teams worked through confusion and shock, but when the scene stabilized, David Sager, Tony Mandrusiak, and Cindy Sims were pronounced dead, and Rod Chaco survived with serious injuries that would follow him for the rest of his life. And then several other riders were treated for minor injuries after the train came to rest. In the hours that followed, a provincial inquiry examined the wreckage and the maintenance history, and its conclusions were blunt because the root cause was traced to design and manufacturing flaws, compounded by maintenance practices that did not prevent critical fasteners from loosening over time, and once those bolts failed, the entire safety chain collapsed in sequence. The Mindbender was shut down, and when it eventually reopened months later, it did so only after extensive redesign, with fewer cars per train, additional restraints, and modified safety systems intended to prevent a repeat of the wheel assembly failure. But for the families involved, those changes came after the point where they mattered most. And when the Mindbender was finally decommissioned and closed in 2023, long after the crash faded from headlines, the memory of June 14th, 1986 resurfaced again. But before we continue, kindly like this video and subscribe for videos like this. On September 5th, 2003, a routine family ride at Disneyland became a fatal mechanical failure that killed Marcelo Torres inside a dark tunnel. That morning at Disneyland in Anaheim, California, the park was already busy, and Marcelo Torres, a 22-year-old animation student, arrived with close friends, expecting nothing more than a carefree day. Marcelo had recently turned 22, he was studying animation at Brooks College in Long Beach, and he had a deep love for storytelling and art, so a trip to Disneyland felt perfect. Big Thunder Mountain had been operating since 1979, and over the years it built a reputation as thrilling and fast but controlled, with no inversions and simple lap bar restraints. So when Marcelo boarded the train that morning with his best friend Vicente Gutierrez, sitting in the front passenger car directly behind the decorative locomotive, there was no sense of risk. But about 13 seconds into the ride, as the train approached a tunnel section, the failure began because the locomotive's guide wheel assembly, which helped keep the engine aligned to the track, came loose after bolts installed during recent maintenance were not properly tightened or secured. As the bolts worked free, the guide wheel dropped, and the locomotive's axle shifted into a position it was never meant to occupy. Inside the tunnel, the effect was immediate and violent, because the loosened axle slammed into brake components mounted between the rails, forcing the front of the locomotive downward and the rear upward, and in that pitching motion the engine broke away from the passenger cars. The separation turned one train into two moving masses inside a confined space, and then gravity and momentum finished what the loose bolts started. As the locomotive pitched upward, it struck the roof of the tunnel, and then it came crashing down onto the first passenger car, the car where Marcelo was seated. The impact crushed the fiberglass and metal frame of the car, and the full weight of the locomotive collapsed onto the seating area, pinning Marcelo in place, trapping him in his seat while the rest of the train shuddered to a stop behind him. Vicente, who was sitting next to Marcelo, later described hearing a sudden noise, something loud and wrong, and realizing instantly that this was not part of the ride, and then he blacked out, waking and losing consciousness again as the train settled. When he regained consciousness, he saw Marcelo motionless beside him and their other friends injured behind them, and in the darkness of the tunnel, the chaos was terrifying. Emergency crews reached the train quickly, riders from the remaining cars were evacuated, and 10 other passengers were treated for injuries. But Marcelo had suffered fatal internal trauma, and despite paramedics' efforts, he died at the scene, becoming the first person to lose his life on a Disneyland attraction due to a ride malfunction. As investigators began pulling the ride apart piece by piece, a troubling pattern emerged, because the failure was not sudden or unpredictable, but avoidable. Records showed that unusual clanking and clicking noises had been heard on Big Thunder Mountain in the weeks leading up to the crash, and on the day of the accident those noises were still present. 3 days earlier, maintenance crews had replaced a guide wheel but failed to tighten the bolts to specification and did not secure them with safety wire, and although a warning indicator appeared, ride operators were not properly trained to understand its meaning, so the ride continued running. But Big Thunder Mountain already had a safety stain long before Marcelo ever stepped into that car, because in 1998, a 5-year-old boy was seriously injured when his foot became trapped between the train and the loading platform, and the injury later led to an amputation. So the state investigators concluded that this was not a single mistake in isolation, but a systemic failure involving maintenance errors, inadequate training, and poor communication. And as attorney Wiley Aitken, who represented the Torres family, later stated, this was not just one mechanic getting it wrong, but a breakdown in how safety was managed across the attraction. Disneyland shut Big Thunder Mountain Railroad immediately, and the ride remained closed for months, reopening only in March 2004 after extensive retraining of staff and revisions to maintenance procedures. The Torres family filed a wrongful death lawsuit, which was later settled for an undisclosed amount, and, in the aftermath, Marcelo's parents chose to donate a portion of the settlement to fund scholarships for aspiring animators, honoring the career their son never got to finish. A roller coaster at Battersea Park in London rolled backwards, derailed, and killed 5 children while injuring 13 others. On Tuesday, 13 May 1972, school children and families gathered at the funfair inside Battersea Park in southwest London, and the main attraction that afternoon was the wooden roller coaster known as the Big Dipper, a ride that had carried thousands of children over the years and had built a reputation as thrilling but familiar. The weather was fair, the queues were long, and nothing about the scene suggested that within minutes it would become one of the deadliest amusement park disasters in British history. At around mid-afternoon, a train carrying 31 passengers, most of them children, began the early phase of the ride as it was being hauled up toward the starting point, and this was the moment designed to feel calm because the lift hill was meant to be slow and controlled, giving riders time to look around before the drop. But as the train was pulled upward, the haulage rope that connected it to the lifting mechanism suddenly failed, and instead of stopping safely, the train began to roll backwards down the track. A survivor later recalled seeing the ride operator hitting the brakes, but the brakes did not respond, and as the train accelerated in reverse, the cars failed to take the bends properly, so one of the carriages jumped the rails and smashed through a wooden barrier near the station area. The crash unfolded in seconds, but its effects were devastating, because the runaway train collided near the loading zone where another train was waiting, and the force of the impact threw carriages off alignment and trapped passengers inside twisted wooden structures. Screams upon screams, and adults rushed toward the wreckage, while children who had been laughing moments earlier were pulled from the cars, injured and terrified. And by the time emergency services arrived, the scale of the tragedy was already clear. 5 children had been killed, and 13 others were seriously injured, many of them left with lifelong physical and emotional scars. The children who died were later formally identified as Alison Comerford, aged 15, David Sate, aged 15, Thomas Harmer, aged 12, Deborah Robertson, aged 12, and Shirley Nash, aged 8. And once their names were released, the story stopped being about a ride and became about children who had simply gone out for a day of fun and never came home. In the days that followed, investigators examined the Big Dipper in detail, and what they found painted a troubling picture, because reports described the coaster as being in poor condition, with multiple defects and maintenance issues that should have been addressed long before the accident. The failure of the haulage rope was only the beginning, because the emergency braking system had not functioned correctly and the ride's overall safety design had not prevented a backward runaway from turning into a fatal collision. As public anger grew, the case moved into the legal system, and by February 1973, committal proceedings began, leading to a manslaughter trial at the Old Bailey later that year against those responsible for operating and managing the ride. Families hoped the courtroom would finally explain how a popular attraction in a major London park had been allowed to reach such a dangerous state. But in November 1973, the defendants were acquitted, and for many survivors and relatives, the verdict felt like another loss layered on top of the first. The funfair never recovered from the disaster, and within 2 years it closed permanently, with the Big Dipper dismantled and the site left as a quiet reminder of what had happened. One sharp metallic crack cut through the noise of a summer afternoon, and in seconds, a trusted roller coaster became a fatal trap. On June 25, 2023, Helena Eriksson, a 35-year-old woman, visited Gröna Lund in Stockholm, Sweden, a park that had stood along the waterfront since the 19th century and was deeply woven into the city's culture. It was a warm Sunday, the park was busy, and Jetline, one of Gröna Lund's most iconic roller coasters, was running as it had thousands of times before. So when Helena boarded the train and took a seat near the front, nothing about the moment felt dangerous or unusual. Jetline was a high-speed steel coaster, known for its sharp turns and aggressive pacing rather than extreme height, and riders often described it as intense but reliable. As the train departed from the station, it climbed, accelerated, and entered its sequence of drops and curves exactly as designed, and for the first moments, the ride behaved normally. However, hidden within the train's structure, one critical component was already failing. A suspension arm, designed to stabilize the wheel assembly and keep the car aligned to the rail under heavy load, had weakened over time, and as the train reached a high-stress section of track, that arm suddenly snapped. The failure was instantaneous, and with that single break, the mechanical balance of the train was lost. The front portion of the train lifted and twisted, wheels no longer held firmly against the track, and the coaster partially derailed while still moving at speed. The cars jolted violently, restraints strained under forces they were never meant to absorb, and in that chaotic motion, Helena was thrown from the train, ejected as the structure failed around her. She suffered fatal injuries immediately, while several other riders were slammed into their seats and surrounding metal, sustaining serious injuries. The train came to an abrupt stop. Screams echoed through the park, and witnesses on nearby pathways froze as they realized something catastrophic had happened. Park staff rushed toward the wreckage, emergency services were called within minutes, and the area around Jetline was rapidly sealed off as police and medical responders took over. Multiple injured passengers were transported to hospital, but Helena could not be saved. Gröna Lund closed immediately, and within hours the park announced a full shutdown, cancelling operations as investigators began examining the ride. What followed shifted the story from an unforeseeable accident to a case of preventable failure. Technical inspections revealed that the broken suspension arm showed signs of long-term fatigue, and further scrutiny exposed serious deficiencies in maintenance routines, inspection intervals, and documentation. The component that failed was not experimental or newly installed, but a core structural part that should have been closely monitored and replaced before reaching a critical state. As the investigation progressed, authorities concluded that maintenance negligence was a key factor, and in the months that followed, Gröna Lund's operating company faced legal consequences. Jetline was permanently dismantled, and the accident triggered a nationwide review of amusement ride safety practices across Sweden, forcing operators to reassess inspection standards and accountability. 14-year-old Patrick Kurek was climbing a roller coaster lift hill when the anti-rollback failed just feet from the top. On April 20, 1997, a warm spring Sunday in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Patrick John Kurek, a 14-year-old student, arrived at Bell's amusement park with his family, a place they knew well and had visited many times before. Bell's sat on the Tulsa State Fairgrounds and had been operating since the early 1950s, and on that evening it was busy, loud, and full of families taking advantage of a spring promotion that kept the park crowded well into the early evening. Patrick was there with his twin brother Henry and their parents, and by late afternoon, after walking the midway and trying smaller attractions, the boys asked for one last ride before leaving. They chose Wildcat, a steel roller coaster that had been running since 1974, simple by design, but tall enough to feel serious, with single cars that held 4 riders and a lift hill that rose to nearly 45 feet, about 4 stories high. Shortly before 6 p.m., Patrick and Henry were seated in the front car, secured by lap bars with other riders behind them, including another teenager and a father riding with his 3 young daughters. The train rolled out of the station, the chain engaged, and the cars began climbing the lift hill, slow and steady, the way roller coasters always do, and nothing about the ascent suggested danger. Then just a few feet below the crest, the sound changed. The clicking stopped, the train hesitated, and instead of leveling off for the forward drop, the cars slid backward. For a brief moment, riders likely thought it was a pause or a misfire, but gravity took over, and the train began rolling down the lift hill in reverse, accelerating down the incline with increasing speed, moving in a direction it was never designed to travel. The cause was mechanical and hidden, because the anti-rollback device, the safety system meant to lock the train in place and prevent backward motion, failed. Investigators later found that a plastic component had been replaced with a non-manufacturer approved material, and when that part gave way, there was nothing left to stop the train from becoming a free-moving object on a steep slope. Seconds later, the runaway front car slammed into another car below it on the lift, a collision that happened without warning and without time for riders or attendants to react. The impact was violent, metal striking metal, and in that moment, Patrick was thrown from his seat, suffering a fatal head injury. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but Patrick died at the scene, while 6 other riders were injured, 2 of them critically, including his twin brother. The investigation that followed raised difficult questions because the Wildcat had been inspected just 2 weeks earlier by the Oklahoma Department of Labor and cleared for operation. However, inspectors were not required to dismantle internal components, and the altered anti-rollback part had reportedly been in use for years, unnoticed and undocumented. Officials ultimately concluded that the rollback and collision were caused by equipment failure linked to unauthorized modifications, not rider behavior. Patrick's father and the parents of the injured riders publicly demanded stricter regulations, surprise inspections, and higher liability requirements for amusement parks, arguing that the accident was entirely preventable. Despite that, the Tulsa County District Attorney later announced that no criminal charges would be filed, citing insufficient evidence of criminal negligence, and the case was resolved through civil settlements. Wildcat was dismantled after the accident and later reassembled under a different name at another park, but for the Kurek family, the ride's fate was irrelevant. A familiar coaster on a routine climb had turned backward, and in seconds, a normal family outing ended in a loss that no inspection report or settlement could undo. On February 28, 2025, at approximately 11:50 a.m., a routine maintenance inspection at Fuji-Q Highland in Fujiyoshida City, Yamanashi Prefecture, turned fatal when Iori Kamura, a 29-year-old park maintenance employee, was crushed during work on Eejanaika, one of the most mechanically complex roller coasters in the world. Eejanaika had been shut to guests that morning for scheduled inspection, and the park was quiet in that section, with 11 staff members assigned to the task. Since opening in 2006, the coaster had been known for its fourth dimension design, where seats rotate independently of the track, flipping riders forward and backward at speeds of up to 126 kilometers per hour, and because of that complexity, maintenance work followed strict protocols that required systems to be powered down, mechanical brakes engaged, and constant radio communication between staff before any vehicle movement. Iori was working beneath the ride in close proximity to the rails and a stationary train, a position that was only permitted once power had been cut and movement safeguards confirmed. However, despite those written procedures, the system was still in a powered state, and at some point during the inspection, a breakdown in communication occurred. A colleague, distracted while speaking with another worker, activated the train without realizing someone was in a dangerous position, and crucially, the mandatory warning buzzer that should have alerted everyone on site was not sounded. Then the unthinkable happened. The train moved unexpectedly, rolling while Iori was still underneath, and he was trapped between the vehicle and the rails, suffering catastrophic injuries to his lower body and back. Co-workers rushed toward him immediately, trying to help as the severity of the situation became clear, and emergency services were called within minutes. Iori was transported to hospital, but his injuries were too severe, and he died shortly afterward from hemorrhagic shock, turning a routine workday into a fatal workplace accident. As police secured the scene, the focus quickly shifted to how such a failure could occur on a ride with detailed safety manuals and trained staff. Investigators confirmed that required safety procedures had not been followed, including the failure to fully cut power and the failure to alert workers before activating the train. During questioning, the employee who started the ride admitted, "I was distracted while talking about work with a colleague. I didn't realize someone was there, so I pressed the start button. I didn't sound the buzzer." The incident also revived concerns about Eejanaika's past, because this was not the first time the ride had experienced unintended movement during maintenance. In 2007, an employee had been injured after a vehicle moved unexpectedly during inspection, and in 2012, a loose bolt detached from a moving train and struck a guest below, forcing the coaster to shut down for months and prompting safety changes. Those earlier warnings made the 2025 fatality feel less like an isolated mistake and more like a pattern that had finally ended in loss of life. Authorities launched an investigation on suspicion of professional negligence resulting in death, while Fuji Q Highland shut down Eejanaika indefinitely. The park later reached a settlement with Iori Kimura's family, implemented a new lockout system to physically prevent vehicle activation during inspections, and retrained all staff on updated safety procedures. On April 1st, 2025, the company's president resigned, publicly taking responsibility for the failure, and after confirming the new safeguards were in place, the park announced that Eejanaika would reopen on May 1st, 2025. So let us know what you think about these cases in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.